I was in the middle of research for a different video when I stumbled upon an image that kind of confused me. I'm sure you've seen it too, probably accompanied by a negative or somewhat bewildered headline. It's this side by side of two word marks for Jaguar, the automaker, who recently launched a new rebrand that seems to have caught folks off guard, and not for good reason. The reviews have been scathing, to say the least. I've not seen a single positive comment about this logo, and well, I'm sure those comments exist somewhere deep in the Twitter bot algorithm. I recommend checking out Ben Jordan's video on that, by the way. It is fascinating. This paucity of positive public perception paints a pretty perilous portrait for Jaguar, right? And if so, then why did they do it? And why does this trend of companies abandoning word marks and logos filled with character and artistic value and life keep marching on despite widespread public sentiment that the trend is a failure? In this video, I hope to answer this simple question. What's with all the rebrands lately? There's a really simple answer that I could drop right now and end the video with. Rebrands like Jaguar's create new interest in what would otherwise be aging and increasingly irrelevant brand identities. People weren't talking much about Jaguar in the public discourse, and now they are. Plus, rebrands tend to be quite simple and two-dimensional in order to work on screens and new, smaller display environments. Done and dusted. But neither of these answers really satisfy me, mostly because they don't address two important key factors of rebrands like Jaguar's: style and public perception. Honestly, this section is just here for me to vent a bit about recent design trends. As someone who was formerly a freelance graphic designer and was forced to succumb to them in order to make any kind of money in the late 2010s. Personally, I think minimalism is okay, but there are two different approaches that companies have taken to simplifying their brands, and I have a huge issue with one of them. The first approach is a form of simplification where a company identifies its core values, the character and charm that make its brand unique, and distills them into simple but effective symbols and word marks. Controversially, Burger King's recent rebrand comes to mind for me, and although there's a whole other discussion to be had about nostalgia baiting, from a stylistic standpoint, I think it works very well. The second approach is when a company simplifies just for the sake of simplification, removing the character that defined its brand in favor of word marks and identities that sort of blend into the background. For example, that weird trend where fashion brands collectively decided to load up Canva and use the first sans serif font they saw for their word mark. Or Angie, formerly known as Angie's List, simplifying their brand by deleting 6 letters from their name for some reason. The 2010 Gap rebrand, PayPal, Discord, etc. Some people call this trend blanding because, well, it makes brands bland. But I feel like there's something under the surface, a reason for these disastrous rebrands, because trends don't just appear out of nowhere. A boiled over pot of pasta has to keep slowly warming up before it makes a huge mess. So where did these stylistic trends come from? Well, what first comes to mind is the argument I dismissed earlier regarding digital display environments, but for different reasons. What I assume has happened, and this is just based off of my personal feelings and not on any hard data, just to be clear, is that these minimal design trends first really took hold through digital art, probably as a negative response to skeuomorphic design and maximalism that seemed so prevalent in the late 90s and early 2000s. This is pretty similar to the initial response of minimalism to social realism and abstract expressionism in the mid-1900s. Current minimalist art just looks way better on screens than skeuomorphic art, and since we're all pretty used to screens at this point, it makes sense that art would adapt, especially since culture nowadays primarily takes place on these same screens. Also, these trends of simplicity and minimalism counterbalance feelings of overstimulation, which I made a video about, check it out, by imagining a world where consumption and waste are minimized in favor of appreciating our life and relationships and communities around us. So, what does this have to do with rebrands? Companies naturally need to convince consumers that their product is not only worth the price, but is something that will solve a problem of the consumer. If the cultural zeitgeist is attempting to combat consumption through minimalist design trends, how do you convince people to consume? You orient your brand as one that is simple, straightforward, and that is somehow participating in that cultural moment while simultaneously operating in contrast to it. You pull a 2010s Apple advertising that your product will help people live a simpler and easier life, so long as they consume what you have to sell. And this was wildly successful for the companies that were able to pull it off, whether it be clothing companies using simplistic designs en masse, to the rise of meditation and minimalist productivity app subscriptions, to fast food companies with healthier and simple offerings. The consensus was that if you couldn't beat anti-consumerist sentiments, you had to act like you were anti-consumerist, that your company was one of the cool kids and was on trend. And what I think is happening with these recent rebrands, and certain rebrands in the 2010s as well, is companies either failing to recognize what the cultural trend actually was in the first place, or flailing and attempting to respond to it. That Gap rebrand is a great example of a company just completely failing to recognize what the trend was even about, and abandoning what made their brand so iconic in order to chase it. And this Jaguar rebrand is a good example of a flailing company attempting to respond to cultural trends without understanding how they work and why their brand doesn't really fit into them. Not to say the new Jaguar is minimalist, since we don't know enough about their campaign to know what trends they plan to utilize, but either way, the style of their rebrand so far, and of so many failed rebrands of the recent past, is that of a company attempting to utilize cultural forces to their benefit, only to reflect a degraded version of culture back towards the consumer. And this is rarely convincing and leads me to my last point. So yeah, it turns out that folks generally have a negative sentiment towards rebrands like the ones we've just discussed. A common argument, however, is that these feelings, coupled with bad press, actually gained the company sales due to their rebrand becoming the hot button issue of the moment. This also isn't convincing because, well, imagine McDonald's. They have a timeless brand image which they have refined over the years with minimal major overhauls to their logo and key symbols. The only recent one that comes to mind is the redesign of their restaurants, which occurred over a decade ago. Safe to say they have a stable brand, but their sales have been declining recently. So what do? Well, say they follow this philosophy of negative press is better than no press and rebrand in a way that is striking and controversial. They keep the logo, sure, but they introduce a new mascot, Cocky the Cockroach. It's raunchy, it's innovative, it's dirty. And while this takes the internet by storm and might create a short burst of interest, a food establishment reorienting itself toward a symbol associated with foodborne illness is almost certainly a bad decision. Even if folks ironically rally behind the mascot through memes and internet culture, the vast majority of people will simply not want to eat at a restaurant that reminds them of cockroaches every time they go there, when they could easily go to a restaurant that doesn't do that. This also reminds me of the time that Sony Pictures responded to the ironic Morbius movement in 2022 by putting the movie back in theaters, only for it to flop worse than the first time. All this to say, ironic support does not equate to sales. And while that hypothetical is obviously a bit dramatic, it helps to clarify that negative press would likely not be a good thing for any business attempting to sell a product, even a fast food restaurant, where the product is only a few bucks. Imagine how poorly negative press affects a car company where the entry-level sale is tens of thousands of dollars. Likely, consumers would rather invest their money in a car company that either has a steady and predictable brand, or one that is modern and luxurious in a way that feels real and reliable. This Jaguar rebrand achieves neither of these things. So what's with all the rebrands lately? Well, rebranding isn't a new trend, obviously, but this consistent run of poor rebrands over the past 5 to 10 years can probably be boiled down to this. C-suite executives want their company to feel hip and modern, but they misunderstand what actually is hip and modern to the current culture, and so they prompt their design firm of choice to create a rebrand that is hip and modern. When design firm XYZ hands back their roughs with a series of options that are actually hip and modern, these don't match the image that the executives had in their head because they're not simple enough. They stray from the failing brand's image too much, or on the flip side, they're actually too similar to the existing brand that customers know. And so, over revision after revision after revision, these companies and their leadership not only lose sight of their initial goals for rebranding, but of the cultural trends they were attempting to emulate in the first place. And 5 years later, Jaguar decides to finally go live with their new logo and wordmark, which feel like they represent an odd and distorted version of what pop culture looked like 5 years prior. And the brand lasts 5 to 10 years, the public responds negatively, and executives grow dissatisfied, and the process starts over again. Or if you're Gap, the process starts immediately, because seriously, what the fuck was that? Either way, it isn't like these companies are investing hundreds of millions of dollars into intentionally poor rebrands just to grab your attention, because sure, they want your attention, but not for the wrong reasons. And large overhauls like Jaguar's are almost certainly not due to the dominance of screens in modern advertising, considering their first new advertisement video is busy and flashy and all of the things you wouldn't want on websites that significantly compress busy and flashy videos. Nope, it's likely just an out-of-touch company attempting to reinvigorate their brand, but failing to understand how to do it properly, and subsequently facing the consequences of negative popularity. It remains to be seen if Jaguar's declining sales will be affected by its rebrand, but regardless, its public image certainly has been. And that's it for this video. Stay tuned for more videos like this, or more videos not like this. The options are endless here on my channel. See you in the next video, where we will, once and for all, solve political polarization in modern America. How exciting.